You don't belong in this suite." The words cut through the marble lobby so sharply that even the pianist near the lounge bar stopped playing for half a second. Vanessa Cole slowly turned her head toward the front desk, rainwater still dripping from the sleeve of her dark wool coat after the cold Manhattan storm outside. The lobby of the Grand Kingsley Hotel glowed with gold chandeliers and polished black marble floors, the kind of place where billion-dollar deals were whispered over expensive whiskey and where staff members were trained to recognize wealth before a guest even spoke. Vanessa had spent 16 straight hours traveling from Los Angeles after a brutal week of board meetings, acquisitions, and non-stop negotiations, and all she wanted was the presidential suite she had reserved 3 weeks earlier. But the man standing behind the front desk wasn't looking at her reservation. He was looking at her skin. Richard Whitmore, the hotel manager, adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and forced a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "Ma'am," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "the presidential suite is reserved for exclusive clients only." Vanessa stared at him calmly. "I know," she replied. "That's why I booked it." A couple standing near the elevators exchanged uncomfortable glances. Somewhere behind them, a suitcase rolled slowly across the marble floor before stopping completely. Richard leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound fake polite. There must be some confusion. Vanessa reached into her leather handbag and placed her ID and confirmation email on the counter. Richard barely glanced at them. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, on her natural curls pulled neatly behind her shoulders, on the simple black dress beneath her coat that looked elegant without screaming for attention. To him, that simplicity didn't register as confidence. It registered as someone pretending to belong. "People like you do this all the time," Richard said with a soft chuckle. "They walk in here hoping they can talk their way into restricted suites." The sentence landed like a slap across the room. Several guests looked away instantly. Others kept staring. Vanessa remained completely still. That calmness somehow made the moment even heavier. Richard mistook her silence for weakness and continued. "Let me save you the embarrassment before security gets involved. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe." These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Vanessa Cole. The rain hammered softly against the giant glass windows facing Park Avenue, while Vanessa slowly slid her reservation confirmation closer to Richard. "Check again," she said quietly. Richard finally picked up the paper, glanced at the name, then smirked. "Interesting." He typed something into the computer for less than 3 seconds before shaking his head. No valid reservation. Vanessa already knew he was lying. She had personally received the confirmation from the hotel's executive booking office. But she also recognized something else. Richard wasn't trying to solve a problem. He was performing for the room. Performing authority. Performing superiority. Performing the kind of power small people use when they think nobody will challenge them. A young black valet near the entrance watched silently, his jaw tightening as another wealthy guest in a gray designer coat walked directly past Vanessa toward the front desk. Richard's entire face changed instantly. "Good evening, sir," he said warmly. "Welcome back to the Grand Kingsley." The man checked in within 30 seconds. No ID questions. No suspicion. No humiliation. Vanessa noticed every detail. So did everyone else. Richard handed the guest his room key, then turned back toward Vanessa with cold irritation. "Ma'am, if you continue causing disruption in this lobby, I will have to ask you to leave." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Disruption?" she asked softly. Richard crossed his arms. "This hotel maintains standards." The words hung in the air like poison. A woman near the concierge desk covered her mouth in shock. Somebody near the lounge quietly whispered, "Oh my God." But Richard had gone too far to stop now. He pressed a discreet button beneath the counter. Seconds later, a tall security guard began walking slowly toward the front desk, while Richard stared directly at Vanessa with absolute confidence, completely unaware that within the next hour, his entire career was about to collapse. The security guard stopped a few feet away from Vanessa, uncertain enough to hesitate, but trained enough not to question Richard in public. The entire lobby felt colder now, even beneath the warm chandelier light reflecting across the marble floor. Vanessa slowly removed her rain-soaked coat and folded it neatly over her arm while Richard watched her with growing irritation. He expected anger. He expected tears. Maybe even an outburst that would justify throwing her out of the hotel completely. Instead, she looked at him with the kind of calm that made arrogant people uncomfortable. "Please repeat what you said earlier," Vanessa said softly. Richard blinked once. "Excuse me. The part about people like me." Several guests nearby suddenly became very interested in their phones. Nobody wanted eye contact anymore. The young black valet near the entrance lowered his head slightly, already knowing exactly where this was going. Richard forced another polished smile, but this time it carried a sharp edge beneath it. "You are misunderstanding me, ma'am. I simply said that certain guests attempt to access accommodations beyond their reservation level." Vanessa nodded slowly. "And you assumed that about me before checking anything." Richard leaned against the counter. "Experience teaches pattern recognition." The sentence landed even worse than the first insult. An older woman standing beside the concierge desk frowned openly now. A businessman waiting near the elevators shook his head under his breath. But nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged him. Vanessa had seen this silence before. In boardrooms, airports, luxury stores, restaurants where people suddenly stopped smiling once they realized the black woman walking in was not staff. The details changed, but the feeling never did. That heavy pause where everyone noticed discrimination happening but waited to see whether it would become ugly. Before deciding if they cared, Richard tapped the counter impatiently. "Now, if you cannot provide proof of ownership for the reservation, I am going to ask security to escort you off the property." Vanessa reached into her handbag again and calmly placed a black American Express Centurion card onto the marble counter. Even the security guard recognized it immediately. Richard looked at the card for half a second before pushing it back toward her without touching it. "Cards can be borrowed." A quiet murmur spread through the lobby. Vanessa looked directly into his eyes for the first time since entering the hotel. "Interesting," she said quietly. Richard crossed his arms. "You think this is funny?" "No," Vanessa replied. "I think it is revealing." The word hit him harder than she intended. For the first time, something uncertain flickered across his face before disappearing beneath his professional mask. Vanessa picked up her phone and glanced briefly at the time. 11:43 at night. Then she typed a short message and held the phone to her ear for less than 10 seconds. "I am here," she said calmly before ending the call. Richard smirked immediately. "Of course," he muttered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "You people always know somebody." The valet near the door closed his eyes for a brief second, like the comment physically hurt him. Vanessa slowly turned toward Richard again. "You people?" Richard realized too late that he had spoken the thought out loud instead of keeping it hidden behind corporate language. "I did not mean anything by it," he replied quickly. "You are twisting my words." But the atmosphere in the lobby had changed now. Before, people were uncomfortable. Now they were watching closely. Vanessa noticed a little black girl sitting near the lounge area beside her mother, staring silently toward the front desk while clutching a small teddy bear against her chest. The child could not have been older than 8. Vanessa recognized the expression immediately. Confusion mixed with awareness. The moment a child realizes the world treats certain people differently. Vanessa looked away slowly, jaw tightening just slightly before her. Calm returned. Richard mistook that brief, emotional shift as weakness again. "Look," he said with fake patience. "There are many excellent hotels downtown that might fit your situation better." Vanessa tilted her head. "My situation?" Richard spread his hands dramatically. "This property caters to a very specific clientele." Before Vanessa could answer, one of the front desk employees quietly stepped closer to Richard holding a tablet. The young employee looked pale, nervous. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "I think there may be something you should see regarding the reservation." Richard barely glanced toward him. "Not now, sir," the employee repeated more urgently. "The system is showing executive clearance access attached to her profile." Richard's face hardened instantly. Then he laughed softly under his breath. "That is impossible." Vanessa said nothing. She simply watched him continue digging the hole deeper beneath his own feet. Richard snatched the tablet from the employee's hands with the kind of sharp movement people use when they feel control slipping away. The young employee immediately stepped back, shoulders tense, while the security guard near Vanessa quietly shifted his weight, no longer certain who the actual problem in the lobby was. Richard stared at the screen for several seconds, reading the same information again and again as if repetition might somehow change it. Then he let out a dry laugh. "This is obviously some kind of error," he said loudly. "There is no way she has executive clearance access." Vanessa remained silent beside the counter, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her carry-on bag, while the rain outside continued streaking across the giant windows facing the street. Midnight traffic rolled slowly past the hotel entrance, headlights reflecting against the wet pavement like moving rivers of white light. Inside the lobby, nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. The tension had become impossible to ignore. Richard handed the tablet back with visible annoyance. "Pull up the booking history," he ordered the employee. "I want to see who authorized this reservation." The employee hesitated. "Sir," the reservation came. "Directly through Executive Corporate Services." Richard's jaw tightened instantly. Then somebody made a mistake. Vanessa finally spoke again. Or maybe somebody made an assumption. Richard ignored her completely. His pride had taken over now, pushing him deeper into the very thing common sense should have stopped. He turned toward the security guard. "Stay nearby." The guard nodded uncertainly, but did not move closer to Vanessa this time. Richard noticed the hesitation immediately and became even more defensive. "Ma'am," he said stiffly, "until we fully verify your identity, you will not be granted access to any premium accommodations within this property." Vanessa looked calmly around the lobby before returning her eyes to him. "You still think this is about verification?" Richard folded his arms. "I think people become very creative when expensive rooms are involved." A soft gasp came from somewhere near the elevators. The older woman who had been watching earlier now looked openly disgusted. Even a bartender behind the lounge counter stopped pretending not to listen. Richard could feel the room turning against him, but instead of stepping back, he doubled down harder. Some people confuse authority with invincibility. Vanessa had spent years studying those kinds of men. Men who believed titles protected them from consequences. Men who spoke confidently because they had never been forced to examine the ugliness beneath their assumptions. Richard pointed toward a seating area near the lobby fountain. "You can wait over there while we investigate." Vanessa did not move. "Investigate what exactly?" Richard forced a smile that looked more strained by the second. "Potential fraud." The word echoed across the marble floor. Even the little girl near the lounge looked shocked now. Her mother quietly pulled her closer without saying a word. Vanessa slowly nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "Do you realize every person in this lobby understands what you are doing?" Richard gave a dismissive shrug. "I am doing my job." "No," Vanessa replied softly. "You are protecting your comfort." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the front desk phone suddenly rang. One sharp ring, then another. The young employee picked it up quickly. "Grand Kingsley front desk," he said nervously. His expression changed almost immediately. "Yes, sir. She is here." Richard frowned. "Who is it?" The employee covered the receiver with his hand. "Corporate Regional Operations." Richard rolled his eyes with irritation and grabbed the phone himself. Richard Whitmore speaking. His confident posture lasted less than 5 seconds. Vanessa watched carefully as the color slowly drained from his face. "No, sir," Richard said quickly. "There seems to be some confusion regarding a guest claiming executive status." A pause. Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, she is still in the lobby." Another pause. This one longer. Richard's eyes slowly shifted toward Vanessa for the first time with something dangerously close to uncertainty. "I understand," he said quietly before hanging up. The lobby had become so silent that the soft jazz music from the lounge now sounded strangely distant. Richard placed the phone down carefully, trying to regain composure, but the small cracks were visible now. Vanessa saw it immediately. Fear. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But real. Richard cleared his throat. "Corporate is reviewing the matter." Vanessa picked up her handbag calmly. "Good." Richard attempted one final recovery. "Until then, I still need secondary identification, proof of business affiliation, and documentation connected to your reservation." Vanessa stared at him for a long moment before reaching into her bag again. This time, instead of pulling out paperwork, she removed a slim black folder embossed with a silver logo. The second Richard saw it, his expression froze completely, because the logo on that folder was not the logo of a guest. It was the logo of the parent company that owned the Grand Kingsley Hotel. The silver emblem on the black folder seemed to suck the oxygen out of the lobby. Richard stared at it without blinking, every ounce of confidence draining from his posture one painful second at a time. The logo belonged to Kingsley International Holdings, the parent corporation that controlled not only the Grand Kingsley Hotel, but dozens of luxury properties across the country. It was not public merchandise. It was not something a random guest could fake easily. Only executives, board members, and upper corporate leadership carried those folders. Vanessa gently placed it on the counter between them, like she was setting down a mirror and forcing Richard to finally look at himself. Around the lobby, people who had been pretending not to watch now openly turned toward the front desk. Even the pianist near the lounge stopped completely. Richard swallowed hard before forcing a laugh that sounded thin and unstable. "Anybody can buy a logo online," he muttered. Vanessa did not react. She simply opened the folder slowly. Inside were neatly organized documents, executive briefing reports, acquisition summaries, and financial statements marked confidential. Richard's eyes immediately caught the corporate watermark stamped across every page. The young employee beside him looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "Sir," the employee whispered nervously, "that is authentic corporate material." Richard ignored him again. Pride was still fighting for survival inside him. "I still require formal verification," he snapped. Vanessa looked almost amused now. "You already decided who I was the second I walked through that door." Richard pointed toward the documents. "For all I know, you stole those." Several people in the lobby gasped quietly at the accusation. The older woman near the concierge desk looked horrified now. Even the security guard seemed deeply uncomfortable standing there. Vanessa slowly closed the folder again. "Do you hear yourself?" she asked calmly. Richard straightened his tie aggressively, trying to rebuild authority through appearance alone. "I am protecting this establishment from liability." Vanessa nodded once. "No, you are protecting your assumptions from embarrassment." The words hit harder than any raised voice could have. Richard opened his mouth to argue again, but another phone rang behind the front desk. This time it was not the main desk line. It was the direct internal corporate extension. The young employee froze when he saw the flashing light. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "that line is only used by executive headquarters." Richard grabbed the receiver immediately. Richard Whitmore speaking. His voice tried to sound confident, but it cracked slightly under pressure. Everyone close enough could hear only his side of the conversation. "Yes, sir." Silence. "No, sir, I was simply following protocol." Another silence, longer this time. Richard's face lost even more color. "I understand, sir." Then came the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere in the building. "She is still standing in the lobby." Richard slowly lowered the phone. The lobby had become unnaturally quiet now, the kind of silence people remember years later because they know something irreversible is happening. Vanessa stood there completely composed, one hand resting lightly against the handle of her suitcase, while rainwater continued sliding down the tall glass windows behind her. Richard cleared his throat. "Corporate leadership is on the way." Vanessa gave a small nod. "I know." Richard blinked. "You knew?" "I was the one who called them." That answer shattered the last fragile layer of control he thought he still had. The young employee near the computer suddenly looked back at the reservation screen again, then at Vanessa, then back to Richard with growing panic. "Sir," he said carefully, "her profile has just updated." Richard spun toward him. "What does that mean?" The employee hesitated before answering. "Full executive override access." Richard stared at the screen as if it were written in another language. Then another line appeared beneath Vanessa's profile. "Authorization level, owner access." The employee's face went pale. The security guard quietly stepped farther away from Vanessa, no longer wanting any part of what this situation had become. Richard leaned closer to the monitor, breathing harder now. That cannot be real. Vanessa finally stepped closer to the counter again. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just calmly. "You know what is interesting, Richard?" she said softly. Hearing his first name from her lips made him visibly tense. "You never once asked what I did for a living. You never asked why I was here. You never even tried to hide what you assumed about me." Richard looked around the lobby desperately now, suddenly aware that dozens of eyes were fixed on him. Guests, employees, valets, bartenders, concierge staff. Every single person had witnessed exactly how far he pushed a black woman he believed had no power. Vanessa glanced briefly toward the little girl still sitting near the lounge beside her mother. The child was watching her with wide eyes full of nervous curiosity. Vanessa looked back at Richard. "You wanted proof so badly," she said quietly. "Now you are standing in it." Then, outside the hotel entrance, 3 black executive SUVs pulled up beneath the glowing canopy lights. The moment the executive SUVs stopped outside the hotel entrance, the energy inside the Grand Kingsley shifted completely. Uniformed valets straightened instantly. Concierge staff exchanged nervous looks. Even guests who had been pretending to mind their own business now openly stared toward the revolving glass doors as rain and cold wind swept briefly into the lobby. Richard Whitmore stood frozen behind the front desk, his face pale beneath the golden chandelier light, while Vanessa Cole calmly adjusted the sleeve of her black coat, like none of this surprised her at all. The first person through the doors was a tall, gray-haired man in a charcoal overcoat carrying a leather portfolio against his chest. 2 more executives followed closely behind him, moving quickly with the focused urgency of people responding to a corporate emergency. The older man scanned the lobby once before his eyes landed directly on Vanessa. Relief crossed his face immediately. "Ms. Cole," he said, walking straight toward her. "I apologize for the delay." Every employee within hearing distance visibly stiffened. Richard looked like somebody had pulled the floor out from under him. Vanessa greeted the executive with a calm nod. "Good evening, Daniel." Daniel Harper, Regional Director of Operations for Kingsley International Holdings. Richard knew exactly who he was. Everybody in upper hotel management knew who he was. Daniel turned toward the front desk slowly, and the warmth disappeared from his face the instant he looked at Richard. What happened here? The silence afterward felt unbearable. Richard immediately tried to recover. "Sir, there appears to have been confusion regarding identification protocols and executive verification." Daniel cut him off sharply. "Do not insult me with corporate language." Richard stopped breathing for half a second. Vanessa remained silent. That was the part making this even worse for him. She was not attacking him. She was simply allowing the truth to stand there by itself. Daniel glanced around the lobby, noticing the staring guests, the uncomfortable employees, and the security guards still lingering nearby. "You involved security?" he asked coldly. Richard swallowed hard. "As a precaution." Daniel looked disgusted. "A precaution against what exactly?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately, because now he had to say it out loud. Now he had to explain why a black woman standing quietly in a luxury hotel had automatically become suspicious in his mind. Vanessa watched him carefully. So did everyone else. Richard finally forced words out. "I believe there might be fraudulent access connected to the presidential suite." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "Based on what?" Richard's eyes flickered briefly toward Vanessa before dropping away again. That tiny movement said everything he could not admit publicly. Daniel noticed it instantly. So did the guests. So did the little black girl near the lounge whose eyes never left Vanessa for even a second. Daniel slowly exhaled through his nose, trying to control his anger. "Do you have any idea who you were speaking to?" Richard's voice became smaller now. "I understand there has been a misunderstanding." Vanessa finally spoke again. "No," she said quietly. "There was an assumption. Then there was a decision. Then there was humiliation." The words landed heavily across the marble lobby. Richard looked physically uncomfortable now, shifting his weight constantly while sweat formed along his forehead despite the cold air. Daniel turned toward Vanessa carefully. "Ms. Cole, headquarters has already initiated a review." Vanessa nodded once. "Good." Then she looked back toward Richard. "How many times has this happened?" "Before tonight." Richard blinked rapidly. "Excuse me. How many guests walked through these doors and got treated differently because they did not fit your image of wealth?" Richard immediately shook his head. "That is not what this is." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Really?" Her calmness was devastating. She never raised her voice once. Never lost control. And somehow that made Richard appear even smaller every minute. Daniel motioned toward the front desk computer. "Pull his guest complaint history." The young employee obeyed instantly, fingers shaking slightly over the keyboard. A few seconds later his expression changed. Then changed again. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" The employee hesitated before answering quietly. "There are multiple prior complaints involving discrimination concerns." A heavy silence swallowed the lobby. Richard's face lost all remaining color. Those complaints were never substantiated, he said quickly. Vanessa looked at him steadily. Tonight substantiated them. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sound of rain outside suddenly seemed louder than before. Then Daniel turned fully toward Vanessa and lowered his voice respectfully. Your suite is prepared whenever you are ready, Miss Cole. Richard's eyes widened slightly at the tone Daniel used with her. Not polite hospitality. Not standard executive courtesy. Respect. Real respect. And for the first time that night, Richard finally understood one terrifying truth. Vanessa Cole was not simply another executive inside the company. She was someone even corporate leadership answered to. Richard Whitmore could feel every eye in the lobby locked onto him now, and somehow that made the silence worse. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had controlled this entire room with the confidence of a man who believed he understood exactly who belonged inside luxury and who did not. But now his expensive suit suddenly looked too tight around his collar, and the polished authority in his voice had collapsed into nervous fragments. Vanessa Cole stood calmly in front of the marble counter while Daniel Harper remained beside her, posture straight, expression unreadable. Rain continued tapping softly against the towering glass windows of the Grand Kingsley, but inside the lobby, nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. Guests who had already checked and lingered near the elevators pretending to look at their phones. Bartenders stopped cleaning glasses. Bellhops stood frozen beside luggage carts. The entire hotel felt suspended in one impossible moment. Richard finally forced himself to speak. Miss Cole, he said carefully, if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, I would like to personally apologize. Vanessa looked at him for several seconds before answering. A misunderstanding happens by accident. Richard swallowed hard. I assure you that was never my intention. Your intention was visible from the beginning, Vanessa replied calmly. The words hit him like cold water. Daniel turned toward the front desk employees. Clear the lobby cameras from 11:15 tonight until now and archive everything. Richard's head snapped toward him. Daniel, that is not necessary. Daniel slowly looked back at him. You do not decide what is necessary anymore. The sentence landed with brutal finality. Vanessa noticed the little black girl near the lounge, still watching her closely while holding on to her mother's hand. The child looked confused but fascinated, like she was witnessing a lesson nobody had explained to her before. Vanessa recognized that expression because she had worn it herself decades ago. She remembered standing beside her own mother in department stores while security guards followed them aisle after aisle. She remembered waiters speaking to white colleagues instead of speaking directly to her during business dinners. She remembered learning very young that power did not protect black people from humiliation. Sometimes it only made certain people resent them more. Richard cleared his throat again, desperate now. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Vanessa shook her head immediately. No, the answer was calm but absolute. You were comfortable humiliating me publicly. We can finish publicly. Several employees looked down at the floor after hearing that. Richard's breathing became shallow. I never intended. Humiliation. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. You called security on me before checking my reservation. Richard said nothing. You accused me of fraud without evidence. Silence. You said people like me do this all the time. The room became painfully still again. Daniel watched Richard carefully, almost giving him one final opportunity to show honesty. But pride still poisoned him. I was following instinct, Richard muttered weakly. Vanessa nodded once. Exactly. That single word destroyed him more completely than shouting ever could have. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. Richard, do you understand who Miss Cole is? Richard looked toward Vanessa uncertainly, terrified of the answer now. Daniel continued. 3 months ago, Kingsley International Holdings underwent a controlling acquisition. Vanessa remained silent. The majority ownership transfer was finalized 48 hours ago. Richard's face slowly lost what little color remained. Daniel looked directly at him. Vanessa Cole is the new principal owner of this hotel group. A quiet gasp spread across the lobby like a wave. The older woman near the concierge desk covered her mouth completely. One bartender whispered something under his breath. Even the security guard looked stunned. Richard blinked repeatedly, as if his brain could not process the sentence. Owner, he whispered. Daniel nodded once. Every property, every executive division, every board decision. Richard turned slowly toward Vanessa again, but now the way he looked at her had completely changed. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained was panic and disbelief. Vanessa stared back at him with the same calm expression she had carried since entering the hotel. "You asked earlier if I belonged here," she said quietly. Richard lowered his eyes immediately. Vanessa glanced around the lobby one last time, taking in the watching guests, the silent employees, and the little girl near the lounge whose eyes looked brighter now than before. Then Vanessa returned her attention to Richard. "The dangerous thing about prejudice," she said softly, "is that it blinds people right before the truth arrives." At that exact moment, 2 additional corporate executives stepped through the revolving doors carrying legal folders and audit binders, and every employee near the front desk instantly understood this was no longer simply an apology situation. This was the beginning of a corporate reckoning. The legal binders carried into the lobby changed everything. Until that moment, some employees still hoped this disaster might end with a private apology and a quiet reassignment memo hidden deep inside corporate paperwork. But the second the legal team entered the Grand Kingsley, everybody understood this situation had already traveled far beyond hotel management. Vanessa Cole stood near the front desk with complete composure, while 2 attorneys and a senior compliance officer approached Daniel Harper carrying tablets, sealed folders, and audit documents stamped with the Kingsley International Holdings crest. Richard Whitmore looked physically sick now. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie again and again, clinging desperately to tiny movements because he no longer knew what else to do. The guests watching from the lobby remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Earlier, people looked at Vanessa with suspicion because Richard framed her as someone who did not belong. Now those same eyes looked at her with awe, respect, curiosity. The entire hierarchy inside the room had reversed. Vanessa calmly removed her gloves while Daniel stepped closer beside her. "The preliminary reports are already coming in," he said quietly. Vanessa nodded. "How bad?" Daniel glanced briefly toward Richard before answering. "Worse than we expected." Richard immediately shook his head. "This is being exaggerated." One of the attorneys opened a tablet and spoke without emotion. 7 prior guest complaints involving discriminatory profiling over the past 18 months. Richard's face tightened instantly. None of those claims were proven. The compliance officer looked directly at him. 3 guests left the property permanently after filing reports. Another pause. 2 involved executive-level clients. Richard stared in disbelief. "Why was I never informed?" Daniel looked at him coldly. "Because the complaints were buried at property level." That sentence hit the room heavily. Vanessa watched Richard carefully now, studying the collapse happening behind his eyes. She had seen powerful people unravel before. The moment when arrogance realizes consequences are finally real. Richard looked toward Vanessa again, desperation growing clearer every second. "Miss Cole, I had no idea who you were." Vanessa answered immediately. "That is the problem." Silence swallowed the lobby again. The little black girl near the lounge slowly stood beside her mother now, still watching Vanessa closely like she could not look away. Vanessa noticed her again, and something softened briefly in her expression before disappearing. Richard tried one final defense. "You have to understand, luxury hotels deal with security threats constantly." Vanessa nodded once. "And somehow those threats always seem to look like me." Richard opened his mouth, then stopped, because there was nothing left to deny anymore. The truth had become too visible. Daniel motioned toward one of the executives, who handed Vanessa a leather folder. She opened it slowly while the entire lobby watched. Inside were finalized ownership transfer documents signed just 48 hours earlier. Vanessa closed the folder again before speaking. "I bought this company because I believed the brand still had value." Her voice stayed calm and measured. "But value is not marble floors and chandeliers." She glanced around the massive lobby. "Value is how people are treated when nobody thinks they are important." Several employees lowered their eyes immediately. Richard looked completely defeated now. Vanessa continued. "Tonight was supposed to be a quiet inspection visit. Nobody here was informed I was coming." Daniel nodded beside her. "Only corporate legal and acquisition leadership knew." Vanessa looked back toward Richard. "Which means your behavior tonight was natural." That sentence hurt more than termination ever could, because it meant this was not a mistake. Not stress. Not confusion. It was character. Richard's voice cracked slightly now. "I am asking for a chance to make this right." Vanessa studied him carefully before answering. You had dozens of chances tonight. The compliance officer stepped forward carefully. Ms. Cole, would you like us to continue this review upstairs? Vanessa shook her head slowly. No. She looked around the lobby again. Everybody here deserves to hear this part. Daniel straightened beside her immediately. Vanessa's gaze moved across the employees standing frozen behind the front desk. A company does not become toxic overnight, she said calmly. It becomes toxic one tolerated moment at a time. One ignored complaint. One excuse. One person deciding somebody else does not belong. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Vanessa finally turned back toward Richard. You thought power looked a certain way? She said softly. That is why you could not recognize it standing directly in front of you. Richard lowered his eyes completely. For the first time all night, he had nothing left to say. Then the elevator doors opened behind Vanessa, and another executive walked into the lobby carrying a single sealed envelope marked immediate action required. The sealed envelope in the executive's hand seemed heavier than paper should have been. Every person in the lobby watched as he walked directly toward Daniel Harper and quietly passed it over without saying a word. Daniel opened it carefully, scanned the first page, then looked toward Vanessa for confirmation. She gave a single calm nod. That was all he needed. Richard Whitmore stared at the envelope like a man watching the final seconds before impact. His shoulders had collapsed completely now. The polished confidence that once filled the lobby with arrogance had disappeared, replaced by visible fear and exhaustion. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Effective immediately, he said evenly. You are being suspended pending full executive review and discrimination investigation. The words echoed across the marble lobby with absolute finality. Richard blinked rapidly. Suspended. Daniel's expression did not change. Your executive access has already been revoked. One of the compliance officers tapped a tablet screen. Security permissions disabled. Another employee quietly removed the manager credentials from the front desk system while Richard watched helplessly. Vanessa stood silently beside the counter, not celebrating, not smiling, not humiliating him back. That somehow made the moment even more devastating. Richard looked toward her desperately. Ms. Cole, please. Vanessa met his eyes calmly. Tonight was not about me. Richard looked confused for a second. Vanessa slowly turned toward the employees standing behind the front desk. It was about every person who walked into this hotel before tonight and left feeling smaller than when they entered. Nobody moved. Several employees looked ashamed now. The young front desk worker who first warned Richard about Vanessa's profile stared quietly at the floor while gripping the edge of the counter. Vanessa noticed him immediately. What is your name? She asked gently. The employee looked startled. Ethan, ma'am. Vanessa nodded. You tried to speak up earlier. Ethan swallowed nervously. I should have done more. Vanessa's expression softened slightly. Most people stay silent because they are afraid. Ethan lowered his eyes. I was. Vanessa glanced briefly around the lobby before answering. Courage usually starts that way. The little black girl near the lounge smiled faintly after hearing that. Her mother squeezed her hand tightly, emotion visible across her face now. Richard stood frozen beside the counter while two corporate security representatives quietly approached nearby. They were not aggressive. They did not touch him, but their presence made reality impossible to avoid anymore. Daniel spoke again. Human Resources and Legal will contact you tomorrow regarding next steps. Richard nodded weakly, barely hearing the words. His entire identity had been built around authority, around deciding who belonged in spaces like this. And now that authority had vanished in front of dozens of witnesses, Vanessa slowly picked up her leather folder and closed it carefully. Do you know the saddest part about all this? She asked quietly. Richard looked at her without speaking. You could have treated me with dignity without ever knowing who I was. The sentence crushed what little remained of his composure. Richard looked down immediately, shame finally replacing defensiveness. Vanessa continued calmly. Respect should not depend on someone's title, bank account, or skin color. Daniel nodded beside her. That philosophy will now become mandatory policy across every Kingsley property. Several employees exchanged surprised looks. Vanessa turned toward the compliance officers. I want mandatory bias and hospitality ethics training implemented company-wide within 90 days. One of the executives immediately took notes. Yes, ma'am. I also want a direct guest reporting line independent from local management. Understood. Vanessa paused briefly. and review every discrimination complaint previously dismissed at property level. Daniel looked impressed for the first time all night. Not because of power, because of clarity. Vanessa was not focused on revenge. She was focused on changing the system that allowed men like Richard to operate comfortably for years. The rain outside had finally begun slowing, soft streaks sliding down the giant windows while the city lights shimmered across wet streets beyond the entrance. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere no longer felt tense. It felt transformed. The young black valet near the doors stood taller now. Employees who looked terrified earlier now seemed thoughtful instead. Even guests watching nearby appeared affected by what they had witnessed. Vanessa looked once more toward the little girl near the lounge. The child smiled shyly this time, and Vanessa smiled back gently. It was small, quiet, but somehow more powerful than everything else that happened that night. Then Daniel stepped beside Vanessa respectfully. "Your presidential suite is ready whenever you are, Miss Cole." Vanessa glanced toward the elevators before looking one final time at Richard Whitmore, who now stood alone in the same lobby where he once believed he controlled everything. "Power reveals character," she said softly, "but so does the absence of it." Then she turned and walked toward the elevators while the entire lobby silently moved aside to let her pass. The elevator doors closed softly behind Vanessa. Cole, sealing away the noise of the lobby below as the presidential suite level illuminated above her in gold numbers. For the first time that night, silence finally surrounded her. No accusations, no staring eyes, no forced smiles hiding ugly assumptions beneath polished hospitality. Just quiet. Daniel Harper stood beside her respectfully, holding a tablet against his chest while the elevator climbed higher through the center of Manhattan. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Vanessa watched the reflection of the city lights slide across the mirrored elevator walls while rain continued fading outside beyond the glass skyline. "I should have caught this sooner," Daniel said quietly at last. Vanessa kept her eyes forward. "You cannot fix what people are rewarded for hiding." Daniel nodded slowly. "Still, tonight should never have happened." Vanessa gave a faint smile that carried more exhaustion than anger. "Tonight happens every day somewhere." The elevator doors opened onto the private executive floor. Thick cream-colored carpet softened every footstep as two attendants immediately straightened near the suite entrance. Unlike the tension downstairs, there was no uncertainty in their faces. Only professionalism, respect. One attendant stepped forward carefully. "Welcome, Miss Cole." Vanessa nodded politely and entered the presidential suite for the first time. The room stretched wide across the top corner of the hotel, glowing with warm lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a panoramic view of Manhattan after midnight. Rain shimmered across the streets below while streams of headlights moved endlessly between skyscrapers like rivers of white and gold. The suite was stunning, but Vanessa barely noticed the luxury. Her attention drifted instead toward the silence inside herself. Daniel carefully placed the legal folders on a nearby table. "The executive board will want a full statement by morning." Vanessa slowly removed her coat and laid it over a chair. "They will get one." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "For what it is worth, the staff downstairs will remember tonight for the rest of their careers." Vanessa looked toward the massive windows, overlooking the city. "So will that little girl." Daniel understood immediately who she meant. The child in the lobby, the one watching everything. Vanessa walked slowly toward the glass windows and folded her arms quietly. "When I was her age," she said softly, "my mother took me to a luxury hotel in Chicago for the first time. I remember a woman at the front desk asking if we were lost." Daniel remained silent. "I also remember my mother smiling anyway." Vanessa stared down at the city lights below, not because it did not hurt, but because she refused to let humiliation become her identity. Daniel lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Vanessa continued quietly. "People think moments like tonight are only about anger. They are not. They are about accumulation. Years of being questioned, measured, doubted before you even speak." The room fell silent again except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Down below, New York continued moving like nothing extraordinary had happened. Taxis rolled through rain-soaked streets. Late-night restaurants glowed beneath neon signs. Millions of people carried invisible stories no one else would ever fully understand. Daniel finally spoke again. "What happens to Richard now?" Vanessa took a slow breath before answering. That depends on whether he learns something from tonight. Daniel looked slightly surprised. You are not asking for termination? Vanessa turned toward him calmly. Removing one man changes nothing if the culture that shaped him stays untouched. Daniel studied her quietly, and for the first time all night, he understood why investors trusted her with billions of dollars and entire companies. Her strength was not built from intimidation. It came from clarity, principle, vision. Vanessa glanced toward the coffee table where a welcome gift basket waited untouched beside a handwritten card addressed to her. She almost laughed at the irony. Just 1 hour earlier, the same hotel had treated her like an intruder. Now the entire building stood on edge waiting for her next decision. Power changed people quickly, but truth changed them even faster. A gentle knock sounded at the suite door. One of the attendants stepped inside carefully. Ms. Cole, he said respectfully, there is someone downstairs asking if they may send a note to you. Vanessa raised an eyebrow slightly. Who? The attendant hesitated. The young valet from earlier. Vanessa thought for a moment, then nodded. A few minutes later, the attendant returned carrying a folded piece of paper. Vanessa opened it slowly. The handwriting was careful but slightly shaky. Thank you for standing there tonight. Some of us needed to see it. Vanessa stared at the note quietly for several seconds before folding it again. Then she walked back toward the giant windows overlooking Manhattan while the first hints of dawn slowly began softening the edge of the distant skyline. The city looked different now, not because it had changed, but because somewhere downstairs, people who once stayed silent had finally seen what dignity looked like when it